In the summer of 2022, the Lucerne Festival made its theme Diversity. This, albeit not the first nor the only classical music institution that took on the task of thematizing anti-Black racism in the wake of global Black Lives Matter protests, still caused a lot of heated responses. While I will focus on the various reception of the Summer 22 theme Diversity in this presentation, I want to highlight here briefly also how such fits into a larger reckoning in the music world in particular, but also then in Switzerland with anti-Blackness. While the theme was diversity, it seems that the festival curators had in mind very much an attempt at combating specifically anti-Black racism, as some commentators have mentioned. While a current topic at the time of 2020, the summer of 2022, it was in the works since 2019, according to Intendant Michael Hafliger, that is the theme diversity. This means that this theme was decided upon before any kind of discourses in especially Switzerland that would allow for confrontation with anti-Blackness. Although in 2019 and the years leading up to it, work by people such as, for example, seminal scholar George E. Lewis has been moving towards thematizing the exclusion of Black voices, particularly in the new music world, but also slowly in the classical music world. A milestone was arguably the major new music festival Darmstadt's Defragmentation project from 2017 to 2018, upon which followed many other projects and meetings in the new music world. Another influential and important milestone I was also a part of was a conference centered around Black lives directly led by or co-organized by Louis, as well as the new music ensemble based in Frankfurt, Ensemble Modern. And the conference was titled Afro-Modernism in Contemporary Music and took place in the fall of 2020 and was streamed globally. This conference started or was begun to be planned after the defragmentation project in Darmstadt. Thus, it is clear that the Lucerne Festival's curation is not a singular and self-contained kind of event. There have been what we might call a movement on the way of reckoning with anti-Black racism in the new music world in particular, but also classical music world, maybe here more so in the US and England. But at the same time, the notion of anti-Black racism had before Black Lives Matter protests and the murder of George Floyd not been recognized as a deep-rooted issue, or particularly in Switzerland. And since then, I just want to briefly note that anti-Black racism has been labeled an urgent problem by the UN, which they reported in a briefing in January 2022. Thus, we must come to grips with two things. Firstly, the term diversity can on the one hand be thought as a kind of what I called elsewhere hack, so as to thematize something that is claimed not to exist here in Switzerland or in classical music. Secondly, the term diversity, albeit not common in the Germanophone world as a term to fight racist inequalities, has been one in frequent use in the US, especially in institutions and corporations. I will engage in this text the issues with this particular term, but I would like to initially also point to the way it plays out in Switzerland and thus in this particular scene and the specific problems or issues it might engage, or discourses it might engage here in this space. The term and other close terms to diversity have been claimed by Switzerland as a kind of identity. And this is evinced by brilliant analysis and controversy The analysis was done by Noemi Michel regarding the discourses circulating the well-known ad by the SVP in 2007, this sheep ad, where we see a poster containing 3 white sheep inside a red space, symbolizing Switzerland, and 1 black sheep being kicked out. The ad garnered a lot of critique, but none of them took race and anti-blackness as a matter of the issue in specific. Telling is for also in relation to this response by the Geneva municipality. To counter this ad, they created and supported this poster of 23 different looking sheep representing Switzerland's cantons. The rhetoric around this counter poster was to affirm the diversity of origins of Switzerland as a nation, and that Switzerland is essentially made from immigrants. That was sort of the message. As Michel poignantly observes in her article Sheepology, the responses played directly into the SVP's attempt to circumvent any notion of racism present in the ad, calling the blackness of the black sheep a matter of mere color. This can be summarized under the heading of multiculturalism, analyzed by Jared Sexton in Amalgamation Schemes. In this scene, to put it succinctly, the purity of race is reified through displacing impurity onto individuals who are mixed or into a past. So transporting mixedness into the past with such also, of course, race. And this, rather than end racism, actually articulates it by solidifying the very categories that are apparently being mixed. In fact, the erasure of race happens here through a claim to having no race problem at all, through already having a diverse community, through already being post-race, and here exactly to this displacing in time, which we might also hear under the heading of another fundamental technique of anti-blackness, if we may call it that, namely colorblindness. It is the normalization of racism's effect, a modality of colorblindness that accompanies multiculturalism as an evasion of having race be an issue in the present in this scene. Thus, we might say that it is the erasure of racism from here through time, or to absolutely containing it in individuals that anti-blackness needs, that is part of anti-blackness. Through this, anti-blackness can claim control over and against blackness and black lives by the ability to keep it at a distance. In turn, refining and purifying an unmarked, and now we might call this a proper here, or a proper set of subjects. Let me put this in somewhat different terms. The very attempt to erase blackness and race from here is the purification of here, that in the same turn remains unspoken, hence unmarked. Anti-blackness thus locates and holds blackness in absentia of itself, or of the inside. Of course, the overall theme, diversity, can be likened to the scene of multiculturalism. But at the same time, one must also remember that the possibility of a discourse around anti-blackness and exclusion in general must be raised in some manner. In other words, in the absence of a possibility to be able to engage anti-blackness or this kind of anti-black racism, that is a space such as Switzerland or the classical music world that defines itself exactly as without any race or racism, there needs to be a kind of problematization of the very inability of discourses to be able to tackle this problem. By centering Black lives with such also the exclusion of them under the heading of a discourse that seems to bespeak a fundamental Swiss value, a kind of problem in these values and their application is uncovered. The Federal Council member Ignacio Cassis gave at the opening of the festival a speech about the way in which diversity is a Swiss value and how Switzerland is supposedly exemplary in its diversity. This followed by a series of first performances of works by Black composers and the presence of Black musicians and composers on stage, which made some recognize the rarity or disparity or the census of this scene and what they're hearing, as some journalists have mentioned, and as a result revealed the lack in this so-called exemplary diversity. So in some ways, this opens a question about Switzerland's value of diversity and how it is exclusionary despite this valuing of diversity. In other words, it is not so exemplary after all. Fascinatingly, in an article in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, or NZZ for short, the article is titled Vielfalt ist nicht alleine Frage der Hautfarbe. The author mentions this particular speech by the council member and at the same time attempts to divert from the question of skin color. A resort to discourses of multiculturalism comes to the fore. But here it's also evinced almost too obviously how such works as an erasure of Blackness and anti-Blackness. This happens through reducing Blackness to merely a skin color or to some kind of a priori fixed group. These notions erase anti-Blackness and the active exclusion of Black people, as well as race, or we might also say racialization itself. And we must mention here that the article's claim to multiculturalism uses notion of kinship, and in such exclusively thematizing white people's ancestry, and thus also attempts to erase kinship as a question of race, while at the same time clearly there is the discourse is racializing, because it marks some as having authentic access to history, whereas it leaves others out. For example, telling in conjunction with this is another article also published in the NZZ, where artist étoile Taishan Sori is denied an authentic historicity. Here, another modality of colorblindness comes to the fore, the use of abstract liberalism, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls it. That is, the use of abstract liberal democratic ideals or discourses so as to erase all questions about race or racism. At the same time, there's actually also a kind of tokenization at play here. It is through the critique of tokenism on the grounds often of some ideal democratic utopia without exclusion, what might be summarized in statements such as being invited just because they're Black shouldn't be the case, that tokenism is itself reified. As Sarah Ahmed elaborates in relation to the notion of diversity in institutional structures, this kind of use of diversity simultaneously reifies difference as something that already exists in the body of others. That is, we are diverse because they are here. It also transforms difference at the same time into a property. If difference is something they are, then it is something we can have or own, if we might say. Thus, these kind of critiques at once locate all race in the other or in Black people, and in the same turn make this Blackness into something undesirable. This erasure of questions of race through both localizing those who are raised and in a second step attempting to get rid of their racedness or just of them is the attempt to get rid of race or Blackness. Here, again, trying to make it be somewhere else. It plays out a narrative of leaving race behind. That is a kind of controlled relation to an outside that is raised, which according to scholar Fatima El Taib is a fundamental narrative for European identity. And there are scholars like Nahum Dimitri Chandler and many others in the US who see this in the narrative of emancipation as this notion of leaving Blackness behind, of transcending race and Blackness and slavery towards becoming proper subjects of modernity. It is the attempt to keep race out, to keep it from coming in, race or the raised, and to only let it in control. Pathologizing of Blackness, the turning it into a mere color, a mere condition of the skin, is the anti-Black insights, that is, inside of nations or institutions, attempt at distancing itself from the outside, from others. It can be heard also under the two frames of colorblindness, of minimalization and cultural racism. The first is self-explanatory, and the latter is the transplanting of racism's effects onto other factors such as culture, and in the same turn also erasing the power or racialization, we should say. We might also point it out further under the rubric of representation, to use another example from the media responses to the Lucerne Festival Summer 2022. In the article, Musik ist weder schwarz noch weiß, music is not black nor white, in the NZZ, the author first assumes that programming Black artists is merely about improving disparate representation, and then asks the reader whether that is actually needed. Furthermore, he mentions that such can have the effect, as evinced with women, that more people will be interested after more individuals of that group are visibly represented. Thus, first, anti-Blackness is erased through reducing it to a mere question of representation. And at the same time, its effects, that there are less Black classical artists, is claimed to be simply solved by presenting some examples, which implies that before such benevolent inclusion of some examples, Black people were not interested in pursuing this profession. While it might partially be true that representation will improve who is interested, it is not because of a lack of interest, but because of structural exclusion and aggressions that are experienced by these individuals, that such lack of so-called lack of desire might be so-called lack of desire exists, or might be perceived to exist. A reductive argumentation where Black people are supposedly simply just not interested implies that the problem is with Black people and not with a set of institutions that are entangled in anti-Black structures that actively exclude and exploit Black lives. This is why I said before, it is the pathologizing or turning into a problem of Blackness. What happens is that implicitly, Black skin or skin color, or the notion of skin color with such also, and particularly Black skin, as well as Blackness, becomes reduced to something that is not only a mere addition to a proper human or subject, but it also becomes marked as negative. By reducing anti-Black racism to a matter of a question of mere inclusion, or of simply an individual or a group, it becomes erased and Blackness becomes something negative, which also means Black lives become sides of and as problem. This means that even discourses of inclusion might fail at this point. It is the old story of the issue with assimilation, where search for non-whites either turns into having to erase one's identity or never being able to belong. And usually it means both. This is why, although crucially important and necessary, including people in positions of power or allowing for other issues such as economic equality or broadening the acceptance of musical styles or representation, are not necessarily cures for an anti-Black system. They are part of it, of solving the problem, but they are not the cure. While it is indeed true that anti-Blackness engages all these and many more issues and problems, without thematizing anti-Blackness and Blackness, it is impossible to move past an anti-Black structuring of the world. This is because it is the erasure of anti-Blackness that articulates anti-Blackness. This erasure itself is what is racializing. That is the erasure of anti-Black racism. The idea that one can stop talking about it is thus entangled in the desire that anti-Blackness itself continually reproduces, namely the desire to keep otherness or race or the raced at bay and away from here. Here's also evidence why anti-Blackness cannot be conceived of as one problem amongst many others, or one minority amongst many others. Firstly, such would once more erase anti-Blackness, because it would make anti-Blackness locatable in minority groups or in a group, those who are Black. And if we even just analyze this train of thought, it becomes evident that such is a racialization itself, for it declares the grouping according to phenotypical traits as, even when it's called not biological, still natural. This is this frame of naturalization, right, of colorblindness. That also means, secondly, that anti-Blackness would not be about the creation of whiteness or the upholding of a global structure of resource extraction, right? But it is. Thirdly, it also plays into the very competition that anti-Blackness fabricates for its own erasure. That is, by trying to claim all of racism's effects as natural or cultural or anything else that erases anti-Black racism itself. Such carries with it that then different cultural groups must compete, are thrown to be competing amongst each other. This can be traced back to the early days of modern world. Around the turn of the 17th century, it was necessary to both make it possible for non-Christians to become Christian at the same time, and at the same time to erase or cut off the possible competition to Christianity from other cultures or religious systems or whatever, because Christianity had to be the ultimate and omnipotent religion or view. Thus, around or slightly before the beginning of colonial conquest and slavery, as well as the development of the concept of race, there emerges a narrative of competition that must be favored for one group, which in turn also creates groups as racialized or is entangled in actually in this creation and co-articulated with it. This translated from religion to the conception of the human, where the Caucasoid was considered the closest to the original human form, and the Negroid or blacks the furthest. This evinces how the very creation of different racialized groups is entangled in anti-Blackness as the professing of one group's properness proven on Blackness's degenerativity, as Kant called it. Here's evinced how critiques like, is this not again a new racism that excludes Asians, completely fail. It is the very erasure of anti-Blackness and its systemicness that allows for such discourses that erase anti-Blackness in the first place. Anti-Blackness claims a kind of insight that must be all-encompassing. It bespeaks everything and everyone. It is and has all knowledge and is absolute authority. This erasure of itself as the claim to omnipotency thus also includes the claim to absolute knowledge. Anti-Blackness is, or is also, the claim to see through racism, to be post-race, because it claims to always already know the answer and everything. In this scene, diversity can act as a kind of attempt to claim to be post-race. But it seems that this particular instance of the Lucerne Festival 2022 did not really function this way, if we at least look at the media responses. It seems that this team problematized the very notion of diversity itself in a space that claims to be both race-free and exemplary diverse. The focusing on Black lives, while on the one hand potentially othering or tokenizing, in conjunction with this team in this space, could be thought of as a kind of uncovering of how the cultural values of diversity and inclusion that are so Swiss are broken. How Switzerland and the music world, or the classical music world, is not as diverse and inclusive as it might have been claiming all along. But we mustn't resolve this opening of a problem either through claiming it to be inexistent or resolved, either through having gotten it right or having gotten it wrong. On the contrary, both of these closures of the problem of the question, reify anti-blackness's desire to erase itself, or anti-black structures and anti-black racism. Rather, it is by seeing the cracks in the image of what music is, of what Switzerland is, that comes to the fore the way in which blackness asks us to think in excess of what might be claimed to be known or to be here as proper.
It is in the possibility opened by the thematizing of anti-blackness and the fighting for black lives that the radical musical practice for our world comes to the fore. As artist Etoile of Summer 2022 Taishan Sori elaborates, he works against inequalities through working as a musician, which refigures through a life in music what music as a field and its institutions and involved structures our society can be.